Hi everyone. We've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. My name is Jordan. This happened many years ago when I was at the university. Madison and I had been friends for about 2.5 years when I finally forced myself to ask her out. We'd met during our sophomore year at State University, initially through a mutual study group for our economics class. What started as casual academic collaboration slowly evolved into genuine friendship. Grabbing coffee between classes, texting about random thoughts, and eventually hanging out on weekends. The feelings didn't hit me all at once. It was more like a slow realization that crept up over months. I'd catch myself looking forward to her texts more than I should, or feeling genuinely disappointed when she had to cancel our usual meetups. By the end of our junior year, I was completely hooked, but I kept telling myself it was just friendship. Madison was the type of person who was naturally warm with everyone, so I constantly second-guessed whether her smiles meant anything special or if I was another friend in her orbit. What made it worse was how naturally our friendship flowed. We had this easy chemistry that made every conversation feel effortless. She'd text me random observations about her day, ask my opinion on everything, and genuinely seemed to value my thoughts. When I am around her, I'd have to force myself to focus. I started analyzing every interaction like some kind of detective. When she laughed at my jokes, was it because she found me funny, or was she just being polite? When she chose to go out with me, does that mean something? When she texted me late at night just to share something amusing that happened during her day, was I special, or did she text everyone random thoughts? The turning point came on a Thursday evening at the start of our senior year. We were at a house party, and I watched her spend the entire night talking to a guy I've seen around. Nothing romantic happened, at least not that I could see, but something about watching her laugh at his jokes and lean in when he spoke made me realize I was torturing myself. I was either going to do something about these feelings, or I needed to start pulling back from our friendship entirely. That night, walking back to my apartment, I made a decision that terrified me. I'd been living in this weird limbo for months, constantly wondering what if, constantly hoping for signs that might not even exist. It wasn't fair to me, and honestly, it probably wasn't fair to Madison either. Our friendship had this underlying tension that I was creating by harboring feelings I'd never expressed. The problem was that asking her out felt like the scariest thing I'd ever contemplated. She had become a central part of my daily life. If she said no, I'd have to see her in classes, around campus, at group hangouts with our mutual friends. The potential for awkwardness was enormous. But I forced myself to do it anyway. I spent the entire weekend building up the courage, rehearsing different approaches in my head. I'd practiced probably 50 different ways to phrase it, trying to strike the right balance between casual and sincere. Too casual, and she might not realize I meant it as a real date. Too serious, and I might scare her off if she'd never thought of me that way. When I finally called her on Tuesday afternoon, my heart was pounding so hard. I'd chosen calling over texting because I wanted to hear her immediate reaction, to gauge her tone, and not spend hours analyzing text messages. I kept it simple, dinner at her favorite restaurant on Friday evening, just the two of us. To my complete surprise, she said yes almost immediately. No hesitation. No need to check her schedule, no questions about who else might be joining us. Just genuine enthusiasm and what sounded like excitement in her voice. For a moment, I wondered if she'd been waiting for me to ask, if maybe I'd been overthinking everything. And she felt the same way. Those 3 days between asking and our actual date felt like the longest of my life. I changed my outfit twice, researched conversation topics like I was preparing for a job interview, and even practiced different ways to potentially bring up my feelings if the moment felt right. Part of me wondered if she already knew how I felt about her, but another part worried that I was about to ruin the best friendship I'd built. Friday evening arrived, and I got to the restaurant about 10 minutes early. I'd made a reservation, requested a quiet table, and even checked the menu online to avoid any awkward moments. When Madison walked through the restaurant's front door at exactly 7:30, I felt my breath catch. She looked absolutely stunning. She was wearing this deep blue dress that I'd never seen before, one that hugged her figure perfectly and brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was styled in loose waves instead of her usual ponytail, and she'd clearly put extra effort into her makeup. The way she looked around the restaurant until her eyes found mine, followed by that bright smile when she spotted me, made my heart skip several beats. The dinner started perfectly. Our conversation flowed as naturally as it always did, but there was something different about the atmosphere. Maybe it was the candlelit table. Maybe it was the way she looked, or maybe it was the fact that we both knew this wasn't just another casual hangout. She seemed more animated than usual, laughing more freely, maintaining eye contact longer, and asking me questions about things she'd never shown interest in before. We ordered appetizers that we shared. For the main course, she chose the salmon while I went with the ribeye. Throughout the meal, she complimented the restaurant choice, mentioned how she'd been wanting to try this place for months, and seemed genuinely impressed that I'd thought to make a reservation. The conversation covered everything. What struck me was how engaged she seemed, how she asked follow-up questions and remembered details from conversations we'd had weeks ago. As we moved through dinner, I kept waiting for the right moment to bring up my feelings. During appetizers, felt too early. During the main course, seemed like it might ruin the meal if things went badly. I decided dessert would be perfect. We'd be relaxed, the pressure of ordering and eating would be off, and if she reacted poorly, the evening would be naturally winding down anyway. When the waiter came by to ask about dessert, Madison immediately said yes to sharing the chocolate cake. As we waited for it to arrive, she excused herself to the restroom, and I used those few minutes to mentally prepare myself. This was it. I'd been building up to this moment for months, and I wasn't going to chicken out now. The dessert arrived just as she returned to the table, and we spent a few minutes enjoying it and making small talk about how rich it was. Then, as she took what I assumed would be her last bite, I summoned all my courage and decided it was now or never. I started by telling her how much our friendship meant to me over the past couple of years. I mentioned specific moments. I wanted her to understand that whatever happened next, I valued what we had. Then I told her that somewhere along the way, my feelings had evolved into something more than friendship. I explained that I'd been wrestling with these feelings for months, not wanting to complicate our friendship, but also not being able to ignore them anymore. I was careful to be honest, but not overwhelming, sincere, but not desperate. I watched her face change as I spoke. The relaxed, happy expression from dinner gradually shifted into something more serious, more guarded. Her body language changed too. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands moved from the table to her lap, and she stopped making eye contact as frequently. By the time I finished speaking, I already knew what her answer was going to be. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. When she finally responded, she was kind but firm. She told me that she was flattered, that she cared about me deeply as a friend, but that she'd never thought of me in a romantic way. She mentioned that she valued our friendship too much to risk complicating it with dating. She went on to explain that she was in a place in her life where she wasn't really looking for a relationship anyway. She had job applications to focus on, graduation coming up, and she felt like adding romance to the mix would just create unnecessary stress. She emphasized that it wasn't about me personally, that I was an amazing friend and would make someone very happy someday, but that someone just wasn't her. When she was done speaking, she looked at me expectantly, probably waiting for me to argue with her points, to try to convince her to give me a chance, or to ask if there was anything I could do to change her mind. Instead, I smiled the genuine smile of someone who had just received clarity. I thanked her for being honest with me, told her I appreciated her directness, and said I was glad I'd asked rather than continuing to wonder. Then I raised my hand to signal our waiter. Madison seemed surprised by my reaction. She started to say something about how she hoped this wouldn't change our friendship, but I gently told her that, of course, it wouldn't, that I respected her answer completely. When the waiter brought the check, she reached for her purse, but I waved her off and handed over my credit card. She protested, saying she should pay for her half, but I insisted. I'd asked her out, I'd chosen the restaurant, and I was going to pay regardless of the outcome. After I signed the receipt, I stood up and helped her with her chair. We walked to the parking lot together, and I walked her to her car like I always did. She seemed uncertain about how to end the evening, but I made it easy by giving her a friendly hug and telling her I'd see her around campus. I didn't linger for an awkward conversation or try to nail down when we'd hang out again. I simply said goodnight, waited for her to get safely in her car, then walked to my own car and drove home. The drive home was oddly peaceful. I was hurt, but I wasn't plotting ways to win her over. For months, I'd been carrying around these feelings, wondering and hoping and analyzing every interaction. Now I knew exactly where I stood, and while it wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, it was an answer. The uncertainty was over. Over the next 2 days, I found myself settling into this new reality surprisingly easily. I didn't spend hours replaying the conversation or looking for signs that she might change her mind. I didn't craft the perfect text message to send her. Instead, I felt like I was emerging from a fog I hadn't even realized I'd been living in. I caught up on assignments I'd been procrastinating on, went to the gym, and actually enjoyed hanging out with my roommate without half my brain being occupied with thoughts of Madison. It was like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Then, 2 days later, on Sunday evening, my phone rang. Madison's name appeared on the screen, and I felt absolutely nothing. No excitement, no anxiety, no hope that she was calling to tell me she'd changed her mind. I answered casually. She started the conversation, trying to sound friendly, asking about my weekend and telling me about some usual gists we share. But I could tell she seemed to be working harder than usual to keep the conversation going, and I found myself giving shorter responses than I normally would have. It wasn't that I was being deliberately cold. I genuinely just wasn't as interested in the conversation as I would have been a week earlier. When she asked if I wanted to grab coffee this week like we usually did, I told her I was pretty busy and wasn't sure when I'd have time. After about 10 minutes of this, I could sense she was picking up on my disinterest. Her tone shifted, and she asked me directly if I was okay, if Friday night had changed things between us. I told her I was fine, that I wasn't upset about her answer, but that I really was busy and needed to end the call. That's when she got serious. She started apologizing profusely for rejecting me, saying she'd been thinking about it all weekend and wondering if she'd made a mistake. She said she never meant to hurt me, and that she'd expected me to put in more effort or do something other than just stand up and leave. She admitted that my calm acceptance had caught her completely off guard. She went on to say that she kept thinking about how good Friday night had been before I brought up my feelings, how natural everything felt between us, and how maybe she'd been too quick to dismiss the possibility of something more. She said she'd been so focused on protecting our friendship that she hadn't really considered whether we might be good together romantically. I listened to everything she said without interrupting, just like I had on Friday night. When she finally finished speaking, there was a long pause where she was clearly waiting for my response. I could hear the hope in her voice, the expectation that I'd be excited she was reconsidering. Instead, I told her to forget I ever asked her out. I said that her first instinct on Friday night was probably right, that we were better as friends, and that I didn't want her second-guessing herself just because my reaction wasn't what she'd expected. I thanked her for calling, but said I really did need to go, and then I ended the call. The silence that followed was telling. No follow-up texts asking if we could talk more, no attempts to clarify what she'd meant, no invitations to study together or grab coffee. It was like she finally understood that I'd genuinely moved on and wasn't interested in revisiting the situation. Looking back on the entire experience now, I can see how Madison's reaction revealed a lot about her expectations. She seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't try to argue with her decision or persist in pursuing her despite her clear answer. Her call 2 days later suggested that she'd expected some kind of chase, some drama, some proof that I was willing to fight for her. The irony was that my reaction was actually the result of respecting her enough to take her at her word. When someone tells you they don't want to be with you romantically, believing them and backing off isn't a sign that you didn't care enough. It's a sign that you respect their autonomy over your own desires. I'd learned something important about myself through this experience. I'd always thought that persistence was romantic, that fighting for someone showed how much you cared about them. But actually living through a rejection taught me that real respect means accepting someone's decision the first time they make it. The experience also taught me about the difference between genuine friendship and friendship built on romantic hope. I'd thought Madison and I had this amazing connection, but I realized that most of that connection existed in my head. I'd been reading romantic potential into normal, friendly interactions, building up ordinary moments into something more significant than they actually were. When I removed the romantic lens, our friendship looked different. We were study buddies who developed a habit of hanging out, but we didn't have the kind of deep connection that sustains long-term friendship through major life changes. The chemistry I'd felt was mostly one-sided. This realization wasn't bitter or disappointing. It was actually liberating. It meant I could stop investing so much emotional energy into analyzing our interactions and wondering what everything meant. It meant I could approach future relationships with clearer boundaries and more realistic expectations. The most valuable lesson was about self-respect and knowing when to walk away. There's something powerful about being able to hear no as a complete sentence and respond with grace. There's dignity in being able to accept rejection without taking it as a personal attack or a challenge to overcome. Madison's expectation that I would fight for her revealed something about how she viewed romantic pursuit, but her expectation didn't obligate me to fulfill it. I didn't owe her drama or persistence or proof of my feelings through continued pursuit after she'd clearly stated she wasn't interested. In the weeks that followed our phone conversation, I occasionally saw Madison around campus. She would smile and wave, but there was an uncertainty in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was like she was testing whether I might still be interested in rebuilding our friendship, but I genuinely moved on. I wasn't playing hard to get or trying to make her jealous. I simply wasn't interested in returning to the dynamic we'd had before. I was polite when we crossed paths, but I didn't go out of my way to create opportunities to spend time with her. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most powerful response to rejection is genuine acceptance and redirection of energy toward other people and opportunities. When you stop chasing someone who doesn't want to be caught, you free up tremendous emotional bandwidth for people who actually want to be in your life. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Take people at their word the first time. If someone says they don't want to date you, believe them. If they change their mind later, they'll let you know. Your job isn't to convince them that their feelings are wrong. There's incredible freedom in accepting rejection gracefully and moving on with your life. It shows self-respect, emotional maturity, and confidence that you'll find someone who wants to be with you without needing to be convinced. Most importantly, it allows you to invest your time and energy in people who genuinely want your attention. Sometimes the most attractive thing you can do is walk away with dignity. Sometimes the strongest response is the quiet one. And sometimes, the person who expects drama learns the most from encountering someone who simply smiles, pays the check, and walks out of their life.